Madam President.
The Senator from New Jersey.
Madam President, I rise today to give... Oh, it's a court. Madam President, I ask consent to dispense with the quorum.
Without objection.
Thank you. Madam President, I rise today to give voice to the American people. It's the American people who have had their sons and daughters sent to war. It's the American people who will worry and sacrifice and suffer because of the decision made with little regard for them. It's the American people who deserve to have a say when we send our service members into harm's way. And it's the American people whose voice had not been listened to as we woke up yet again this weekend to a new war in the Middle East. Madam President, I'm proud to stand with my colleagues and co-sponsor this resolution. This isn't just a resolution that pits one branch of government against another. Yes, Congress has a constitutional responsibility to declare war, which is what the president called this. In his own words, said that this was a war. But Congress has a deeper responsibility to speak on behalf of the American people. And we're here to speak on behalf of the American people because the Trump administration hasn't been listening to them. I was a college student a generation ago when our country invaded Iraq. And it was weeks before the invasion, George W. Bush delivered a State of the Union address where he said falsely that Iraq was hiding efforts to produce weapons of mass destruction. And he spoke about proving America's resolve. Now, less than a week ago, President Trump came here to the Capitol to deliver his State of the Union address. Now, he made little effort to make a case to the American people of the need for military operations in Iran, just a few words in the longest ever State of the Union address. But he did speak about proving America's resolve. Madam President, we've seen this before. A president manufactures an imminent threat, chooses to start a war with unclear objectives, and uses America's resolve as an excuse for a war without end because they've got no plan to end it. But unlike 2003, President Trump refused to make a case to the American people. Right in his State of the Union address, he refused to make the case, and he refuses to seek approval for Congress for the use of military force, as President Bush did in 2003. I believe that this is unacceptable. More importantly, the American people believe it too. A week and a half ago, with rumors of war circulating, I held a town hall in Asbury Park, New Jersey. And I asked the people there, raise your hand if you want Donald Trump to order an attack on Iran. Nobody did. I asked them, a couple hundred people in attendance, to raise their hand if they believe that the American people should have a say in any decision that sends American sons and daughters into harm's way in Iran. Everyone's hand went up. Before being elected to Congress, I spent much of my career in national security at the Pentagon, in Afghanistan and Iraq, in the White House National Security Council, working on countering Iranian terrorism. I know the threat from Iran demands a serious approach. And I know that the approach that this administration is taking is not a serious one and is risking long-term damage to the United States and its interests, not to mention the short-term harm and tragedy that we've seen as now the death toll of American service members is up to 6. President Trump and his administration made no serious attempt to find a diplomatic solution to the threat Iran posed to the world. He sent negotiators who were already tasked with negotiating with Russia and Ukraine, with Israel and Palestine. Avoiding war through diplomacy cannot be a part-time job. He took no real steps to bring our allies and partners into the effort that could create a safer world without the use of military force. And President Trump had no meaningful strategy for pressuring Iran through sanctions that actually targeted the regime, not the Iranian people. And Donald Trump's administration and the Republicans in this Congress have actively cut programs like internet freedom efforts that undermine Iranians who were speaking out in their own attempts to bring freedom and stability to the country. While failing to to pursue a more sustainable solution, President Trump planned to put Americans in harm's way with this military operation. But that's where the planning clearly stopped. Asked yesterday, how long will this war go on for? Donald Trump said 4 weeks, then 4 to 5 weeks, while also saying as long as we wanted to. This morning, the president refused to rule out the use of American ground troops in Iran. He said, quote, I don't have the yips with respect to boots on the ground. This came after he said multiple times that he expects service members to be killed in this operation. An open-ended war isn't just antithetical to what the American people want, it's dangerous and unpredictable. We have seen this path before. Pursuing regime change can have significant unintended consequences, and there is no guarantee that what comes next will be better. Trump's shifting of objectives raises questions about whether it will be enough and whether our military will be back at this again in just a few months, as they took today following the strikes last summer that Trump claimed obliterated the nuclear program he now calls a threat yet again. And beyond the near term, this military operation will have lasting consequences even after the bombs stop falling. Donald Trump may think that might makes right, but history proves him wrong. We have the benefit of a generation of time from the last time we were in this situation. Might may have led to regime change in Iraq, but it made our country less secure by doing lasting damage to America's reputation and spawning new threats while weakening our ability to engage globally. It led to more than 4,400 Americans killed. And it's cost our country trillions of dollars, not just in military spend, but in the cost of caring for the tens of thousands of service members wounded and injured during that war. It's why in the Pew surveys of recent years, 62% of all Americans said that the Iraq war was not worth fighting. That number, by the way, was higher with those who fought in it. 64% of veterans of the war said it was not worth it. That is why it's so important that we take actions right now. Let's be clear, Donald Trump chose this war, but it was not his choice to make. It is the American people who deserve to have a say. With this vote that we are pushing forward on, not only have we the opportunity to ensure that the voices of the American people are heard, we have an obligation to ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. I urge my colleagues to join in this bipartisan effort and vote yes. Thank you, and I yield back.
Madam President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I received a text just a couple of hours ago from a Connecticut serviceman serving in the Middle East, directly in harm's way, who asked me a very simple question. What is the vision of success? And I am trying to formulate for him an answer that does justice to his sacrifice, that keeps faith with his family and the tens of thousands of other servicemen and women whose bravery is unquestionable. Their skill is undoubtable. Bravery and skill are not a strategy and alone are not a vision of success. We have said countless times that war must be a last resort, never a first choice. And yet, the administration seems to be engaging in a war of choice that is needless and reckless, conducted chaotically, and most alarmingly, spreading and widening throughout the region. It is no longer a conflict involving only the United States and Iran, or the United States and Israel with Iran. It is now a regional conflagration. War demands precision and discipline in formulating goals and strategy, in conducting the kinetic operations that are the foundation for success. But in this war, which has been rejected while diplomacy is still within reach, the administration has failed to present the American people with a clear objective, an end game, or an exit strategy, and it shows exactly why the founders said that the Congress should have the power to declare war. Not only does the Congress speak for the American people, and they must be the ones to approve war, but an arbitrary and reckless use of war power is more likely when it's done by an autocrat who claims and seizes authoritarian power. There is a discipline imposed when democracy functions, and democracy demands passage of the War Powers Act. That's the reason that I will vote for it and why I have supported it. What is the vision of success? The president has been all over the place in his statements on Truth Social, earlier today on TV, snippets of conversation, 1 or 2 minutes long, with reporters individually. It may be deposing a regime, but so far there has been change within the regime, but no regime change. It may be stopping nuclear capacity, but the president said just last June that its capacity has been obliterated. The Secretary of the State, Marco Rubio, said just half an hour or so ago that the goal was to destroy the ballistic missile capability of Iran before they, quote, cross the line of immunity in a year or a year and a half. Crossing the line of immunity in a year or a year and a half is no imminent threat. Iran has had ballistic missiles for years and the capacity to produce them. The simple fact is there is no imminent threat. And my colleagues have said publicly that their intelligence briefings indicate there was no imminent threat either to the homeland or to our allies in the region that justify this attack on Iran. The simple fact is Donald Trump is workshopping a war. He's making it up as he goes along in real time. He is inventing and then discarding and reviving objectives as though he were a child playing with a puzzle, trying to fit the pieces into a coherent whole. There is no coherent whole right now, and it ought to anger the American people that lives are put at risk, that resources are spent, that the region is now on fire without a strategy or an explanation from the president to the American people. And maybe most alarmingly, the administration continues to talk about regime change. Well, history teaches that regime change almost inevitably leads to boots on the ground and prolonged American involvement. The simple fact is that regime change cannot be achieved at 30,000 feet. Air power alone has never delivered regime change. It is a matter of simple common sense. Bombing cannot achieve a change in the governmental structure of a country. The president has asked that the people of Iran rise up and change their regime. It is an invitation to slaughter innocent lives, potentially lost because of a president that seems to promise relief that he cannot or will not deliver unless our sons and daughters in uniform are put on the ground in Iran with the burden on them in blood and years lost away from home, in wounds that last long after the fighting ends. The president has thrust our nation into a widening war that risks almost inevitable expansion without making the case to the American people, without seeking congressional authorization, without explaining how the conflict ends, and maybe most egregiously, without building support among the American people. We sat in the chamber last week for a speech lasting 108 minutes. Only 3 of those minutes devoted to Iran, and in a very cursory and superficial way. He has failed to build support from the American people because this war is against their wishes. He knows it is against their wishes because he promised he would not engage in such a war, that he would end wars, not start them, that forever wars would be an anathema. And yet, that is the risk that we face now, a forever war. Whether it is short or long, a war must be approved by this body. And I want to be clear. A nuclear-armed Iran is unacceptable. Iran's malign activities throughout the region, its support for terrorist proxies, it's killing its own people, it's killing Americans. This regime has blood on its hands, not just the group that was killed in the attack most recently, but the entire regime. Its destabilizing actions pose a severe danger to us and to our allies, and its terrorist proxies will continue to cause death and destruction throughout the region. So the broad concern about this regime and the threat it poses is well justified. The president stopped negotiation that might have achieved the same ends that he is seeking here. And we have seen this story before, the absence of a clear end state, the disregard for diplomacy, military action for regime change. The president risks repeating some of the most painful chapters in our history, conflicts that were entered with great confidence and bravado, but prolonged without defined purpose or exit. Unilateral action without lawful authorization. This is not how constitutional democracies decide matters of war. And we must not underestimate our adversary amidst this uncertainty. Iran is weakened, but it is far from incapable. Iranian strikes have already killed 6 service members, and the president himself has said that there will be more casualties. It is not a narrow engagement. It is a regional conflict touching many countries, many domains, and potentially many fronts. My foremost concern is for the safety and well-being of the men and women in our armed forces, like the one who texted me earlier today. along with their families who are now in harm's way. I salute their bravery. I pray for their protection, but bravery is not a strategy. Hope is not a strategy. We must remember that civilians are also caught in the crossfire. Families in Iran, in Israel, across the region, whose lives have been tragically changed by this widening conflict. After 20 years of war in the Middle East, after all the lives lost, trillions spent, and promises of quick victory that stretched into years and years of sacrifice, we should be cautious, not reckless, about another potentially open-ended conflict. Iran's pursuit of nuclear capability, its support for terrorist proxies, its repeated attacks on American personnel are dangerous, destabilizing, destructive. They have armed militias across the region. They have threatened Israel's security. So we must be vigilant and resolute. But vigilance is not a strategy either. And wars are unpredictable. Vigilance does not mean impulsiveness. Vigilance requires strategy and objectives clearly defined. The Constitution is clear. Congress alone has the authority to declare war and approve it. It is a necessary part of the process. The War Powers Act requires that the President inform and consult Congress when introducing American forces into hostilities. These requirements are not optional. They are not procedural niceties. They are the constitutional requirements that must be obeyed. The question is raised by many: how long will this conflict be prolonged? The simple fact is, the President has said 4 or 5 weeks, maybe longer, maybe shorter. But we know for sure that the President alone can't answer that question. The enemy has a vote. The enemy can prolong this war. President Trump has chosen the path of war that could lead to American men and women on the ground in Iran without explanation, without imminent threat, without clearly defined objectives. This decision carries consequences that will long outlast his presidency. We have a duty constitutionally to act on the War Powers Act, and I hope my colleagues will join me in supporting it. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
The senator from Hawaii.
Madam President, this is a war of choice. It did not have to happen. There was no imminent threat from Iran. The indications right up until the attacks were that negotiations were actually trending well. And remember that if Donald Trump hadn't pulled out of the JCPOA to begin with, Iran's nuclear program would have been continued to be managed. This is the President of the United States asserting that he can do whatever he wants, wherever he wants, with the most powerful military in history at his disposal. It is important to point out that a lot of people put Donald Trump in office because he promised to oppose forever wars. It was central to his foreign policy pitch as a candidate for over a decade. But what we've seen in the past 2 months alone is a president that is eager to use kinetic force as a first option and then figure it out from there. And the challenge with the Venezuela action was that our men and women in the military and intelligence agencies, they executed that thing so efficiently and effectively that I think Donald Trump got it into his head, this is great. What else you got? This is great. Are we doing this in Cuba? Are we doing this in Iran? What else you got? And so he gets on an airplane and he starts shooting the breeze with members of the Republican Congress, and he decides in that moment on Air Force One to start a war. To start a war. In the days after capturing Nicolas Maduro, the administration offered up confusing and contradictory claims. They said that the United States was going to run Venezuela indefinitely, but then left most of the illegitimate Maduro regime in place. They said that American companies would go in and rebuild the refineries, even though most of the American companies said they wanted nothing to do with it. And maybe most confusingly, they said that the United States would control oil sales, but not the revenue from those sales. 2 months later, we still don't know what their plan is, and that was easy compared to this. That was easy compared to this. There is no coherent strategy, much less an attempt to even explain it. I want everybody to understand how unique this is in American history, maybe world history, to have a leader say, I declare war, and I'll let you know why later. I'm going to send Secretary Hegseth out there to say some things that are kind of indecipherable. Then Secretary Rubio, certainly a better communicator, but also still indecipherable. And then the President of the United States has a press conference, presumably to explain himself. And he's personally so distracted by the ballroom renovation that it makes me sound like I'm some person who is so obsessed with Donald Trump that I watch MSNBC, I have an IV drip of MSNBC and TikTok to make me hate this president. But actually, that's what he did. He took a kinetic action against another country, and then when it was his time to explain why, he sort of talked a bit about it, but then he was really passionate about the curtains that he chose, about the color of the ballroom, about the jackhammers running from 6:30 a.m. to 11 p.m. That's his passion. And he is letting these neoconservatives run wild within his administration. And I want to make a very specific point about hopefully tomorrow's war powers resolution introduced by Senator Kaine and others to block the use of American forces in Iran. I will support that, of course, but make no mistake. If a war powers resolution is defeated, that does not constitute an authorization of the use of military force. The way this works, right, is that a president has some flexibility to basically take a kinetic action, to use the United States military to protect American interests if there is an imminent threat. What do we mean by imminent threat? It is what it sounds like. They're about to attack us. And Secretary Rubio, again, very good communicator, and I talk to him all the time, he said it about an hour and a half ago. He said it. The imminent threat, I want you to listen to this logic chain. The imminent threat to the United States was that Israel was going to attack Iran, and we anticipated that in retaliation, Iran was going to attack our interests, therefore imminent threat. That's not what we mean by imminent threat. There are no bank shots when we're describing an imminent threat. If we want to conduct a war of choice, and we have in the past, we need hearings, we need briefings, we need a proper debate, and then we need a vote on the authorization of the use of military force. That is foundational to the oath of office that we took when we became United States senators. This is actually not a particularly controversial point, except that we're in this very weird moment where I think the public was sort of not tracking at all that maybe the president was going to wake up one morning and go, why don't we go to war with Iran? I'll explain it to you over a period of time. And I understand that his method of communication is, if nothing else, rather unconventional and meandering and contingent, and he thinks he's preserving his optionality. Maybe it'll be short, maybe it'll be long, we'll see what happens, all that stuff. You can't do that with the American people. The American people are not his negotiating counterpart. They are the foundation that you need if you are going to take a military action. If you're going to go to war, you need the American people behind you. And you need them to understand why in the heck are we doing this? Do I think Iran is a malevolent actor in the region and even across the planet? Of course I do. But that's not the question at hand. The question at hand is, why in the world are we trying to do another regime change? Iraq, Libya, Vietnam. I don't care what you think should happen. This is a question of what is very likely to happen based on what always happens when our best designs and our extraordinary, trained, courageous military executes well, and in the first couple of days, there's two things that everybody does. They correctly praise our United States service members. And then they say, oh, if anybody raises any objections, they go, oh, you want that bad guy still in power? Is that what you want? Of course I don't want a bad guy in power. However, the world is full of bad guys in power. And so the question at hand is not, do I wish there were better people in charge of other countries, but rather, has it met the threshold for the United States government to declare war against another country, especially in a region where we keep screwing it up? That's not a rhetorical flourish. I sound like Donald Trump a year and a half ago. He just is so fixated. I don't know if it's the ballroom or his legacy or some sort of revenge fantasy about Iran, but this man is not thinking clearly, either politically or geostrategically. Geostrategically, this is a terrible decision. And he has no plan for what happens next. His view is just like Venezuela. We're going to decapitate the person we don't like. We'll get a client state. Not so easy in Iran. Not so easy in Iran. And these things have a terrible tendency to metastasize. They really do. And after the Iraq War, my goodness, I thought there was going to be bipartisan consensus that we are not going to go into a war of choice again. Congress has a duty not just to check a reckless president, but also to represent the will of the people. And the American people, left, right, and center, do not want another regime change war in the Middle East. It's about time our president started paying attention to the American people. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from California.
Madam President, we are at war, once again, this time with Iran. It is a war that the President declared, incidentally, almost accidentally, when he talked about the prospect of casualties among our bravest service members being a possible outcome. An outcome that has already all too tragically come to pass with the death of 6 of our troops and the grave injury of others. The massive size of the deployment also makes clear this is war, in a real sense, in a constitutional sense. The scale of the bombing, the danger to not only our forces in the region, but to all of our regional partners, the Iranian retaliation through the Persian Gulf, the closing of the Straits of Hormuz, the bombing of our bases, the bombing of ships, Iranian ships, and that of our allies, the length of the deployment, The president says it could be weeks, at least a month or more. He is unwilling to rule out the threat of boots on the ground, American boots on the ground. The president says he may go there. All of this inescapably points to the fact we are at war. We are at war once again. Once again, we are at war without imminent threat of attack on the United States. The president said the Iranian nuclear capability had been obliterated. That was false, but there was no evidence presented by the president that the Iranians were making a mad dash to develop the bomb, no evidence that the centrifuges were spinning out weapons-grade uranium, no evidence they were close to developing the mechanism of a bomb. None. Despite the president's bizarre claim they were 2 weeks away from having a bomb, there is no evidence to support such a baseless, intelligence-free claim. Nor is there evidence that the Iranians had developed a missile capability that could hit the United States. None. And to suggest such things brings painfully to mind the false claims, the overhype of intelligence that got us into the war in Iraq. Have we learned nothing? We are at war once again. We are at war once again without congressional authorization. The Constitution gives Congress alone the power to declare war. That power was placed in our hands by our founders, not by accident, but by design. They feared an executive grown too fond of war-making. And given that now this is at least the third broad use of military force by this president, I believe the founders' worst fears have come to pass. He is too fond of going to war to gain the oil assets of one country and to engage in the regime change of another. Have we given up any semblance of allegiance to that part of our Constitution, the war power, even as we appear to have surrendered our other great power, the power of the purse? Are we now mere constitutional afterthought, not a paper tiger, indeed not a tiger at all? Unable to constrain a runaway executive, unwilling even to demand a vote on an authorization to use force when our troops are getting killed, uncomprehending of the long-term damage we do to our system of checks and balances, of the license we are giving a future president to do as they please, make war as they will, and be confident that Congress will not make a peep, of the license we give to other powers around the world to use force, not diplomacy, in Ukraine, Taiwan, or elsewhere. We are at war once again. We are at war once again over regime change. We have killed the Ayatollah Khamenei. Good riddance. He was a brutal dictator who slaughtered his own people, sponsored terrorism around the region for decades that claimed American lives, and threatened to wipe Israel off the map. Good riddance. Our military attack killed him and over 40 other leaders of the regime. This may have only rid the world of part of the regime, but make no mistake, this war is about regime change. The president has urged Iranians to rise up and take control of their country. He has told them that this may be the last chance they have to do so. He has bragged that no other president has given them this opportunity. Pete Hegseth may try to deny it, but this is what regime change is all about. And regime change is messy. Don't take my word for it, take his, the president, this president, who says that regime change wars unleash chaos. Yes, they do. And that is what this war has unleashed. And what of the brave Iranian people who've been urged to rise up against their rulers, to bring down armed IRGC goons without having the arms themselves to do so? If they do, if they rise up, are we prepared to support them? If they are mowed down, will we come to their rescue? Or will we simply mourn their passing? What is the plan? What are the contingencies? Why has the president left our country and the Iranian people in the dark? Could it be because there is no plan? There is only a hope. Have we learned nothing from Afghanistan? Have we learned nothing from Iraq and elsewhere that it is difficult, costly, dangerous, time-consuming, and deadly to try to change a country, to try to change a culture, to build a new nation in our image or any other, and that it is impossible to do so through the dropping of bombs, the firing of missiles, even long-term occupation? My fellow Americans, we are at war once again, and I join my fellow co-sponsors of this War Powers Resolution once again to urge your support, to demand that this president, if he believes the threat is imminent, that war is justified, that the deaths of our troops are justified, that the expenditure of billions, not on the American people, not on their health care, their groceries, or their housing, is worth the cost, to come before this Congress, this Senate, the American people, and make the case for a war authorization, to make the case now before other service members are killed. Or if not, to cease and desist from further hostilities. Madam President, I urge and I vote, and I yield back.
The senator from Virginia.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that Senator Merkley and I be permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each prior to the scheduled roll call vote.
Without objection.
Madam President, I want to thank my colleague from California, my co-sponsor on the War Powers Resolution that will be heard within the next 48 hours or so. And I spoke on this at some length Thursday before the President launched the U.S. attack on Iran on Saturday morning. And I asked the question, have we learned nothing from 25 years of war in the Middle East? Have we learned nothing? And have we learned nothing from nearly 2 decades plus of war against Iraq and Afghanistan? And I wanted to go into what did the wars against Iraq and Afghanistan mean? Because they mean some things that should compel us to learn some lessons. And then I'll talk about at least a couple of lessons we should learn. In Afghanistan, 2,324 U.S. service members were killed, uniformed troops and DoD civilian, and 3,917 United States citizens who were contractors were killed. 6,241 people were killed, American service members and contractors. 20,913 military personnel were injured in Afghanistan. The injuries among our contractors is unknown. There was a number that was up to 2,500 by March 2007, but we were there until 2021. The actual number is much higher. So 6,241 Americans killed in Afghanistan, and as far as we know, probably more than 25,000 United States military personnel and contractors were injured. Afghan civilians, 46,319 Afghan civilians' deaths have been directly attributed to the war in Afghanistan. What was the cost to the American taxpayer of the war in Afghanistan? $2.3 trillion total cost, including the interest and the future obligation for veterans' care for the veterans who served so honorably. So when I ask about have we learned anything in the last 25 years from the war in Afghanistan, those 6,241 deaths, 25,000 injuries, $2.3 trillion should have taught us something. In Iraq, 4,598 U.S. military personnel were killed in Iraq. I remember early in my time as governor going to Iraq to visit the Virginia Guard troops that were deployed there. and going to the base where somebody I went to church with, who was a state employee at our Department of Social Services, had been killed. 4,598 U.S. military personnel killed, and 3,650 U.S. contractors were killed in Iraq, totaling 8,248 American service member contractors killed in Iraq. The total killed in both Iraq and Afghanistan, 14,489 Americans lost their lives. Each one of them had a name. Each one of them had a family. Each one of them had a life of experience. Each one of them had a future that was never to be. We ought to have learned something from this. In Iraq, 32,000 of our troops were injured, and another 10,569 contractors were injured. That should teach us something. And in the Iraqi civilian population, this was a harder one to analyze and estimate, but the estimates are somewhere between 185,000 and 208,000 Iraqi civilians were killed. And the total cost of the Iraq war, to add to the $2.3 trillion of the war in Afghanistan, was $2.9 trillion, and that's the military cost plus the veterans' care. If you add up the cost of both of these wars, the cost of the war, the cost of the veterans' care, and then the interest on the debt we incurred to pay for the war, the total cost to American taxpayers of 25 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan was nearly $8 trillion. Here's a statistic that stunned me. As of 2021, nearly 31,000 U.S. service members and veterans who served in the 9/11 era, post-9/11 era, died by suicide. 4 times the number of service members who were killed. We should have learned something. We should have learned something. What are the lessons that we should learn from this carnage? From 14,489 of our Americans killed, from 41,000 plus 25, 66,000 of our troops and contractors injured, all this civilian death, all this money. What should we learn? First, that we should not be going into a war in the Middle East or anywhere without a good, solid reason that has had its tires kicked and that has demonstrated that is of a magnitude sufficient to warrant losses that could reach this scale. So what is the reason asserted for going to war with Iran? The president has asserted many reasons. We're doing it to stop their nuclear program, but he had obliterated it 6 months ago, and he had a diplomatic deal that controlled it that he tore up 7 or 8 years ago. So it's not about the nuclear program. We want to protect Iranian protesters. But wait a minute. This president is deporting to Iran Iranian refugees living in the United States, including Iranian refugees who will be persecuted in Iran because of their religion. He doesn't care about Iranians being mistreated by the regime. We need to go to war to stop a ballistic missile program, but the intelligence, as publicly reported, suggests that the missile program is not such that would pose danger to the United States mainland for at least a decade. The president tweeted the other night we should go to war with Iran, or suggested, because they interfered in the 2020 election. He's blaming them because he still can't admit that he lost the 20. Is that what we should send our sons and daughters into war for, because the president can't admit that he lost the 2020 election? Or maybe it's about oil. What are the 2 nations that the president has invaded? Venezuela and Iran. Boy, they're really different nations, except there's one thing about them that's in common. They are both oil-producing nations. This president has asserted no real reason that is clear to the American public, and that's why the American public so far is so against this. And then the other thing is, you shouldn't go in and run this risk with no reasons. And even if you have a reason, you shouldn't go in without a plan. So what's the plan? The president has said it would be 2 or 3 days. The president has said it will be 5 or 6 weeks. The president has said, I'm not going to rule out boots on the ground. The president has said, we will bomb until we're done, and then Iranians take over your government. I mean, that's the plan? We're going to bomb until we stop, and then it's a jump ball for whoever wants to take over. That's not a plan. It's not a plan that is well designed when Kuwait shoots down 3 U.S. F-15s. Kuwait is an ally. We're working together with Kuwait. And in the opening days of this, if an ally is shooting down 3 U.S. F-15s because, oh, wow, we didn't realize they were U.S. planes, what kind of a plan is that? There's no rationale and there's no plan. And without a rationale or a plan, why would we ignore the lessons of the last 25 years? Look, I pray, just like we all do, that the consequences of Iran will not be those that I read to you earlier, the consequences of Iraq and the consequences of Afghanistan. But Iran is a bigger nation than both, with a bigger population than both, and a more powerful military than both. We went into Iraq and achieved what many thought was a very prompt victory. Mission accomplished. We will be viewed as liberators. It seemed like it was smooth sailing a month in. And then 10 years later, those numbers kept racking up and racking up and racking up. Used Lincoln's words from his second inaugural, fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that the consequences of a war against Iran will not be what were the consequences of wars against Iraq and Afghanistan, but we would be foolish to stand here and say we know they will not be. We have to have the humility to acknowledge, with the fact that U.S. service members have already lost their lives and been injured, that we could face serious consequences in the loss and death of our troops, serious consequences in instability in the region, serious consequences in rising energy prices for Americans. Who in the world will be the chief beneficiary of energy prices going up, the cost of oil going up? I'll tell you who: Vladimir Putin. Russia has an economy that is very centered on oil exports and on the prices of natural gas. And Vladimir Putin has just seen a massive surplus likely come in to the Russian state treasury for a significant period of time, as long as energy prices are elevated by this war in the Middle East. We will have this war powers vote within the next 48 hours or so. And every member of this body will do the most solemn thing any of us ever do: vote on whether the United States should be at war. That sounds like an abstraction. Vote on whether we want to send our own kids, our own sons and daughters, the most precious resource we have in this country, into a war that could end up like the wars we have just recently exited in the same region. I pray so hard for my colleagues to exercise the judgment that this is not the right time for more war. If more war with Iran would be the answer, we've been at war with them essentially since 1953, when we toppled their democratically elected government. And it's been back and forth for 70 years, us striking them striking us striking them striking us, hundreds and hundreds, thousands of people killed. If more war were the answer, we would have found it before now. It's not the answer now. I pray that colleagues will support the War Powers Resolution, and I now, Madam President, yield.